Welcome back, everyone. This deep dive, I think, is going to be pretty fascinating. It was actually, one of you listeners who requested it.
Huh.
Wanted to get a better sense of how the U.S. Marine Corps thinks about warfighting.
And, well, they wrote the book on it, literally.
That's right, MCDP 1, warfighting. That's what we're diving into. We'll be taking a look at the forward, preface, kind of get a sense of the table of contents, and then really dig into that first chapter, all about the nature of war.
Yeah. Now, before anyone starts thinking like, oh no, are we going full military tactician here? I actually think you'll find MCDP 1 surprisingly insightful,
Yeah.
even outside of, like battlefield situations.
I agree. It's not just like, diagrams and weapons and all that.
Yeah.
General A.M. Gray, I think it's in his forward, he even mentions how this manual actually changed the way Marines approach warfare, how they think about it. And it even influenced other branches in foreign militaries. It's that impactful.
Yeah, and for me, what's really fascinating is how much MCDP 1 emphasizes the human side of war. It really digs into like the psychology of conflict, something, as a learner, I think you'll really appreciate.
So let's unpack this. MCDP 1 kicks off with a pretty straightforward definition, right? War is a violent clash of interests between organized groups.
Yeah, and not just nation states, like we might picture. Could be international coalitions, could be rebel groups, really any organized force with a political agenda.
So right off the bat, it's highlighting that human element. Then it gets to this interesting analogy. They compare war to two wrestlers.
Yeah, trying to get at the idea that, war is this constant back and forth, right? A real dynamic interaction of opposing wills, always adapting and reacting.
Makes sense. And the point of this whole wrestling match, to impose our will on the enemy.
Exactly. But here's where I think MCDP 1 gets really smart. It reminds us that military force should always serve a political purpose. There's always something bigger at play. It's that political context that really shapes how war plays out, I think, in the real world.
Yeah, it's that link between policy and action on the ground, right?
Yeah.
So how does MCDP 1 actually see those military actions happening? Like, what are the mechanisms?
Well, it lays out sort of two main approaches. First, there's what they call annihilation, but it's, not always about just like wiping everything out, literal destruction. It's really about making the enemy incapable of fighting. And that can happen in more subtle ways too, right?
That kind of makes me think about what's going on right now with current event. Is that MCDP 1's annihilation, or is that a different type of pressure?
That's a good question. While the situations are definitely very different, I think, the underlying principle in MCDP 1 is to make the enemy incapable of achieving their objectives, right? So in a traditional war, that might mean destroying their weapons and their infrastructure, but in other situations, it might mean disrupting their economy or maybe discrediting their leadership.
So it's about finding those pressure points,
Yeah.
right? Those key elements that give them their power,
Yeah.
and then figuring out how to neutralize them.
Exactly. And that leads us to the second approach MCDP 1 outlines, erosion. So not outright destruction, but making continued resistance so costly that it just becomes unbearable for the enemy.
So you're kind of breaking their will rather than just like breaking their weapons, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
But MCDP 1 is very clear. War is never really as simple as these two approaches might make it sound. It's way more complicated than that.
Yeah. And here's where I think it gets even more interesting. MCDP 1 goes on to talk about how messy war really is. And it talks about friction, how even simple actions become incredibly difficult in a warfighting situation.
Right. And MCDP 1 borrows from Clausewitz here, describes friction as that force that makes the apparently easy so difficult. Just imagine trying to coordinate troops, under enemy fire, maybe navigating difficult terrain, dealing with equipment malfunctions. It can get really hairy really fast.
Yeah. Reading about friction in MCDP 1,
Yeah.
It actually made me think about that time when, oh, never mind. It's just amazing how even the smallest things can like totally mess up a plan, right? Just like MCDP 1 says.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just those, those external factors either. MCDP 1 talks about self-induced friction too, right? A poorly worded order, convoluted plans, or just overly complex technology. I mean, all that stuff can really create friction within our own ranks.
So you're not just fighting the enemy, you're also fighting your own internal snags.
Exactly. And MCDP 1 really stresses that overcoming friction It's all about willpower, right? Maintaining that mental and spiritual strength to push through. But wouldn't that make the Marines kind of vulnerable in a situation where speed and adaptability are critical, like in a surprise attack?
That's a good point. It seems like there's a potential conflict there, like MCDP1 emphasizing willpower and pushing through friction, but
Yeah.
wouldn't that sometimes, lead to a slower response time? Like how do you reconcile those two ideas?
It's a balancing act for sure. I mean, MCDP1 acknowledges that overcoming friction is crucial, but it also emphasizes the importance of, agility and adaptability, being able to shift. It's about finding that, that sweet spot where you're pushing through those inevitable challenges, but you're still able to react quickly to the changing situation.
I see what you mean. So it's not about brute force.
Hmm.
It's about having the mental toughness to endure hardship, but also the flexibility to adapt your plans and your tactics as needed. You got to be smart and adaptable.
Exactly. And that brings us to another, key aspect of war that MCDP1 highlights, uncertainty, that infamous fog of war.
Ah, right. Where you never have perfect information. You're always making decisions based on incomplete intel. You never fully know the enemy's plans or even sometimes what your own troops are facing out there.
Yeah, exactly. And, MCDP1 highlights that inherent unpredictability. There's even an anecdote from Clausewitz that they include about, these seemingly insignificant events that ended up swaying entire battles. The fog of war is real.
So even the smallest things can have this huge ripple effect.
Absolutely. And MCDP1's stance is to deal with this uncertainty, you kind of have to accept risk. It's just part of war. It's about, developing adaptable plans, clear procedures, and really empowering subordinates to make those good judgment calls when things inevitably go sideways, which they will.
That makes sense. You can't micromanage everything in a chaotic environment like war, right? You have to trust your people on the ground to make the right decisions when they're facing the unexpected.
Right. And that ties into another key attribute of war that MCDP1 discusses, fluidity. War is this constant flow, this constant state of change, every event kind of shaped by the ones that came before it and shaping the ones that come after.
So you've constantly got to adapt. You got to react to what's happening. It's not a static thing, right? I mean, I feel like MCDP1 is really hammering home that point about how much adaptation is key in war. Every move creates this ripple effect.
Exactly. And that ripple effect can lead to another challenge that MCDP1 highlights, disorder. It argues that disorder is just this unavoidable part of war, and particularly on a modern battlefield with how lethal and far-reaching weapons are these days.
Yeah, with the kind of firepower we have now, it's easy to see how things could get pretty chaotic really fast. So is MCDP1 basically saying that we should just embrace the chaos? I mean, is that the takeaway?
In a way, yeah. MCDP1 argues that we should, learn to operate effectively, even when things are, falling apart, and maybe even use that disorder to our advantage.
That's interesting. That goes against that whole marching in formation, that that classic image of war, right?
It does. And then finally there's complexity. MCDP1 reminds us that each side in a conflict, it isn't the single unified entity. It's a whole network of individuals, units, support systems all working together, and with different objectives and challenges at each level too. So it's not this neat, chain of command or anything. It's way more intricate than that.
So you've got this complex system interacting with another complex system in an environment filled with friction, uncertainty, fluidity, and disorder. It's a lot.
Yeah. Welcome to war, according to MCDP1.
It sounds a little overwhelming, to be honest.
I know, right? That's where the human factor comes in, and MCDP1 really dedicates a significant chunk of the manual to exploring that human dimension.
Yeah, that makes sense given that whole clash of wills premise
Right.
that we've been talking about. So, what are some of the key takeaways about this human dimension in MCDP1?
Well, it really drives home the point that war is fundamentally a human struggle, right? Shaped as much by moral and mental forces as physical ones, which is interesting to think about.
So it's not just about who's got the bigger guns or the faster
Yeah.
tanks, right? It's about things like resolve, morale, leadership, those
Yeah.
really intangible elements.
Exactly. I mean, MCDP1 even says, quote, "War is an extreme trial of moral and physical strength and stamina. Any view of the nature of war would hardly be accurate or complete without consideration of the effects of danger, fear, exhaustion, and privation on those who must do the fighting, end quote. I mean, you're facing constant danger, the potential for death, you know. I can't imagine not being absolutely terrified in that situation. So how does MCDP want to address that fear?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it talks about building unit cohesion and trust as ways to overcome fear, and encouraging leaders to foster courage and resilience in their troops. That kind of esprit de corps.
Yeah. Yeah. Creating that sense of camaraderie, being able to rely on your buddies to get through, you know, the toughest moments. But then it goes even deeper than that. It contrasts the intangible moral forces, you know, things like resolve and morale and leadership, with those quantifiable physical aspects of war, like, you know, how many tanks you have or how much firepower. It actually says, quote, "Although material factors are more easily quantified, the moral and mental forces exert a greater influence on the nature and outcome of war," end quote.
So basically, willpower can trump firepower. Is that what they're saying?
In many cases, yeah, that mental and emotional strength can really be that deciding factor in war.
Okay, that's a lot to digest already. But MCDP 1 doesn't stop there, right? It goes on to talk about the evolution of war too.
It does. MCDP 1 acknowledges that war is, you know, constantly evolving, especially with technology, right? I mean, the ways we fight are always changing.
Yeah, from swords and shields to, you know, to drones and cyber warfare and AI and who knows what's coming next, right? I mean, the tools of war are constantly changing. But is MCDP 1 saying that even with all those advances, that war still boils down to this clash of wills, this human struggle for dominance?
That's exactly it. MCDP 1 views war as this blend of science and art, you know, combining things like logistics and ballistics with the intuition that's needed for strategy and tactics. But ultimately, it argues that war is, quote, "driven by human interaction and willpower, going beyond simple formulas," end quote.
So it's about understanding that human element as this driving force behind war.
Yeah.
Even in, you know, our technologically advanced world. That's a really interesting perspective.
It is, and it lays the foundation for the rest of MCDP 1, which goes on to develop a full theory of war based on these observations about the nature of war.
And that's what we'll explore in part 2 of our deep dive into MCDP 1.
Yeah, that's right. We really just kind of scratch the surface there with that look at, you know, the nature of war. MCDP 1, it goes on to build a whole theory of war from those observations.
Okay, so let's get into that theory. What's the core argument? What are they trying to get across?
Well, the core idea is that war is fundamentally an act of policy, right? It's all about achieving political aims. You know, it's not just fighting for the sake of fighting. There's always got to be a purpose behind it. And MCDP 1's really clear about this. They say, you know, quote, "War must serve policy," end quote. That's kind of the foundation of their whole theory.
So you're saying it's not just about battles and tactics. There have to be these clear political goals behind those military actions.
Exactly. And MCDP 1 even gets into like the different types of political objectives. It could be something like resisting aggression, right? Or maybe it's aiming for the complete surrender of an enemy government. There's a whole spectrum there.
And the way you use force, I'm guessing, should vary depending on what you're trying to achieve, right?
Of course, yeah. If you have a limited goal, you might, you know, use force more strategically, maybe focusing on specific targets. But if you're going for total victory, you might, you know, use force in a much broader, more aggressive way. It really just depends.
So the scale and intensity of the conflict,
Right.
it's directly tied to those political goals. That makes sense. So how does MCDP 1 actually see, you know, those military actions taking shape? Like how does it all play out on the ground?
Well, they lay out, kind of two main approaches to using military force to meet those political objectives. The first one is annihilation, but remember, it's not always about just, you know, wiping out every soldier or every tank.
Right. We talked about that before. It's
Right.
It's about making the enemy, you know, incapable of achieving their objectives. However that list.
Okay. Exactly. So it could be, you know, targeting key infrastructure, maybe disrupting their command and control systems, or even just, you know, demonstrating such overwhelming force that resistance just seems futile, kind of breaking their spirit, so to speak.
You're basically breaking their will to fight, even if you aren't like physically destroying everything.
Precisely. Yeah. And then there's there's a second approach, which is erosion.
Right.
And this is more about, making the cost of resistance so high that it just outweighs any potential benefit for the enemy.
So gradually wearing them down, making it more and more, painful to keep fighting.
Exactly. So targeting, their resources, their infrastructure, maybe even, public support. The idea is to make them choose peace over, over that ever increasing, cost of war.
Okay, so that makes sense in theory, but things aren't always so so black and white in the real world. Does MCDP1 acknowledge that?
Oh, absolutely. MCDP1 explicitly states that that total war and perfect peace. I mean, these are rare. Most conflicts fall somewhere in between, in between those extremes.
So there's this whole range of conflict intensity, right? From these limited engagements to these full-blown wars. So how does MCDP1 see how does it see those different levels actually playing out?
Well, they break warfare down into three levels: strategic, operational, and tactical. Think of it like a pyramid.
Okay, a pyramid. I like it. So let's unpack those levels. What's the strategic level all about?
So that's the very top of the pyramid, right? And the focus there is on those big picture political goals we were just talking about. It's about using all elements of national power to achieve those goals. And military force, it's just one piece of the puzzle there.
So we're talking like diplomacy, economic sanctions, that whole grand strategy thing, all those pieces coming together to achieve those overall political aims.
Exactly. And then you have the operational level, which is kind of the middle of the pyramid, and this is where you're bridging those grand strategic goals with the actual actions on the ground. So it's about translating those big ideas into concrete military operations.
So you're basically translating those strategic objectives into achievable military campaigns, figuring out how to actually make it happen.
Right. So deciding where and when to engage the enemy, what kind of operations to run, how to use your forces effectively. All to achieve those broader goals that are set at that strategic level.
Okay, and then at the base of the pyramid, you have the tactical level. That's where the actual battles and engagements are happening, right?
That's the ground level. Using firepower, maneuvers, coordinating units. Winning those individual fights. But what MCDP1 stresses is that these levels, I mean, they're all connected, right? Decisions made at the top. I mean, they impact what happens in the middle, which dictates how things play out at the bottom. It's all linked together.
It's like a chain reaction, right? You can't just be fighting battles without a clear understanding of why you're fighting and what you hope to achieve.
Exactly. Those strategic goals have to inform every decision, all the way down the line. Although, MCDP1 does point out that these levels, they can get a little blurry sometimes.
Yeah. Like when things are moving so fast, there isn't time to go through that whole, chain of command and all that.
Exactly. In a really intense conflict, decisions have to be made lightning fast, or in situations where even small unit actions can have, huge political consequences. And then the lines between those levels, they can start to blur a bit. A single commander might be making decisions that have both tactical and strategic implications at the same time. It's a fluid system, that's for sure.
So MCDP1 is acknowledging that, sometimes you gotta throw the playbook out the window and you gotta adapt to the situation on the ground.
That's exactly right. And that brings us to another really interesting idea that MCDP1 brings up, which is this interplay between initiative and response.
So who strikes first, basically?
Kind of, yeah. MCDP1 argues that everything you do in war, I mean, it comes down to either seizing the initiative or responding to what the enemy does.
And I'm guessing, taking the initiative is usually the advantageous position, right? I mean, you dictate the terms of the engagement. You force the enemy to react to what you're doing.
You got it. It puts you in control, setting the pace and the direction of the conflict. But MCDP-1, it does acknowledge that responding to the enemy's moves is crucial too, right? It's not all about just attacking blindly.
Right, right. You got to be able to counter their moves, to defend, to adapt to their tactics.
Exactly. So it's this constant back and forth, right? Trying to seize the initiative, trying to dictate the terms of the engagement.
Like a chess match.
Yeah.
That's right. You're anticipating their moves. You're trying to stay, one step ahead.
That's a great analogy. And
Yeah.
MCDP-1 connects this idea of initiative and response to offense and defense.
So offense is, taking the initiative, attacking. Right. Defense is responding, protecting, weathering their attacks.
Yeah.
But isn't that a little oversimplified?
You're right to question that. MCDP-1 argues that these concepts, they're not so clear cut in reality. They're interconnected, and they blend together all the time in the real world.
So even on the defensive, you might launch, offensive actions to disrupt their attack.
Exactly. A good defense, it often, uses elements of offense, counterattacks, aggressive maneuvers, just keeping the enemy guessing.
And when you're on the offensive, you still need to right. I mean, you got to defend your flanks, consolidate your gains. Make sure you're not overextending.
Precisely. Offense and defense. I mean, they're really two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
And they're constantly shifting and adapting, depending on the situation.
So it's more about understanding that interplay between offense and defense than rigidly sticking to one approach or the other.
That's a great takeaway. Yeah. And then MCDP-1 gets into the different styles of warfare, and they kind of place them on the spectrum from attrition to maneuver.
Okay, let's talk about that spectrum. So attrition warfare it's basically about wearing the enemy down,
yes.
right? Just through sheer force.
Right, superior firepower, superior resources, gradually grinding them down until they just can't resist anymore.
So inflicting heavy casualties, destroying their equipment, depleting their resources, just kind of a brute force approach, right?
In a way, yeah. It often relies on having, more troops, more weapons, more resources than the enemy.
And historically, I mean, a lot of militaries have taken that approach, especially when they thought they had, that advantage in those areas.
You got it. But MCDP-1 is very clear. The Marine Corps, I mean, they favor the other end of the spectrum, which is maneuver warfare.
Okay, so how is maneuver warfare different from attrition? Like, what's the core philosophy there?
Well, it's about speed, agility, and surprise. It's about disrupting the enemy's, cohesion, exploiting their weaknesses, attacking where they least expect it. It's a much more, fluid, dynamic approach.
So you're not just throwing everything you've got at their strongest point. You're finding those gaps in their defenses, those vulnerabilities that give you a decisive advantage.
Exactly. It's about flexibility, it's about adaptability, and really exploiting those fleeting opportunities. So, does that mean firepower and attrition are just irrelevant in maneuver warfare?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
'Cause it seems like you'd still need firepower to accomplish your objectives, even if it's not the primary focus of your strategy.
You're absolutely right. MCDP-1 recognizes that firepower is still, it's still essential, even within a maneuver-based approach.
So you're still using it to, destroy enemy units and achieve objectives, but it's not the main strategy. It's more of a supporting tool.
Exactly. The goal in maneuver warfare is to use firepower strategically, right? Concentrating it at key points to disrupt, the enemy system and achieve a quick decisive victory.
Using it surgically, not just unleashing this barrage of force indiscriminately.
Exactly. And MCDP-1 emphasizes that speed is really, really key in maneuver warfare. The faster you move, the more opportunities you have, the more you keep the enemy off balance.
It seems like that could be a double-edged sword, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, moving quickly might create more opportunities, but doesn't it also increase the risk of making mistakes or getting caught out of position?
That's a valid point, yeah.
Yeah.
Speed without careful planning and coordination, I mean, that can lead to disaster. That's why MCDP-1 stresses the importance of, clear communication, decentralized command, and really empowering subordinates to make decisions on the fly. You got to be able to react to the changing situation.
So it's about finding that balance between speed and precision, right? You need to move quickly to exploit opportunities, but you also need to maintain control and coordination so you don't make costly mistakes. It's a delicate balance.
Exactly. And speaking of control, MCDP-1 also highlights the importance of focus. It's not about spreading your forces thin, across the entire battlefield. It's about concentrating your strength, where it will have the greatest impact.
So you need to be able to identify those key points, those critical vulnerabilities, and then direct your forces accordingly. You got to know where to hit them, basically.
Exactly. And to do that effectively, MCDP-1 introduces two really important concepts, which are surprise and boldness.
Okay, let's break those down.
Right.
So surprise, I mean, what does that mean in this context? We're not talking birthday parties here.
No, definitely not. Surprise in this context is all about, catching the enemy off guard, striking when and where they're least prepared, and it creates, disorientation. It disrupts their ability to respond effectively. You can use deception, ambiguity, stealth, all those, those classic tactics to keep them guessing about your intentions and your capabilities.
You can keep them in the dark.
Yeah.
Make them unsure of what you're going to do next.
Exactly. And MCDP-1 points out that the advantage you gain through surprise, it's usually temporary, right? So you have to act quickly and decisively to really exploit it, and that's where boldness comes in.
Okay, so boldness is about taking risks, seizing opportunities, going for the big win.
Yes, but it's not just about recklessness. MCDP-1 argues that boldness, when it's paired with good judgment, I mean that can be a huge advantage in war.
So taking calculated risks, right?
Yeah.
Exploiting those moments of uncertainty and confusion, pushing your advantages as far as you can.
That's the idea. But MCDP-1 is careful to caution against recklessness, right? Boldness without a plan, without a clear understanding of the situation. I mean, that can be disastrous. It can backfire in a big way.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot between taking calculated risks and being foolish.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really crucial concept that MCDP-1 introduces, which are centers of gravity and critical vulnerabilities.
Okay, those sound important.
Yeah.
So what are centers of gravity in this context?
Think of them as the things that give the enemy, their strength, what they rely on to fight effectively.
So it could be their leadership, right? Or their logistics, their morale, or even, specific units that they rely on heavily.
Right. MCDP-1 says that identifying and targeting those centers of gravity, I mean, that's key to victory. If you can disrupt or destroy those key elements, you significantly weaken their ability to resist.
But wouldn't those centers of gravity, I mean, wouldn't those be pretty well defended? It seems like they'd be kind of obvious targets, right?
Absolutely. And MCDP-1, it cautions against attacking those centers of gravity directly. Like, you don't just launch a full-on assault against their strongest point. That's usually not going to work.
So what do you do?
Well, instead, MCDP-1 advocates for looking for what they call critical vulnerabilities. And those are weaknesses that if exploited can open up those centers of gravity, for attack.
So those gaps in their defenses, those moments of weakness or disorganization that you can use to your advantage.
You got it. It might be a poorly defended flank, a gap in their communications, or even a psychological weakness that you can exploit to break their morale. It could be any number of things.
So you're using those critical vulnerabilities as a way to outmaneuver the enemy. You're bypassing their their strengths, and you're striking at those key elements that give them power.
That's the essence of maneuver warfare, and MCDP-1 emphasizes that creating and exploiting opportunities is a big part of that. It's not just reacting to what the enemy does. It's about proactively shaping the battlefield, creating opportunities for yourself, capitalizing on those moments of weakness or confusion.
Always looking for that opening, right? That chance to strike a decisive blow. But it seems like that would require a lot of flexibility, and the willingness to deviate from the plan if a better opportunity presents itself. You got to be able to think on your feet.
Absolutely. MCDP-1 stresses that flexibility and adaptability. I mean, these are key. It's not about rigidly sticking to a predetermined script. It's about being able to think on your feet and seize those unexpected opportunities as they arise.
So to be successful in maneuver warfare, you gotta be able to assess the situation, make decisions quickly, and adapt your plans as needed.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial element of MCDP-1's theory of war, which is decision making. How do you actually make good decisions in the heat of battle?
Yeah, how do you approach that? Because it seems like things can change so quickly, and there's often so much at stake.
You're right, and MCDP-1 is very clear about that. It emphasizes that time is often the most critical factor in war. Being able to make and implement decisions faster than the enemy. I mean, that can be a huge advantage. It's a race against the clock, basically. You're trying to outthink and outmaneuver the opponent.
Trying to stay one step ahead, yeah.
Precisely. And so MCDP-1, it stresses developing rapid decision-making skills, being able to assess the situation quickly, identify the key factors, and make a choice without getting bogged down in unnecessary details.
So being decisive, trusting your instincts, being willing to act even with incomplete information. But aren't there situations where a more deliberate approach is needed?
Of course, yeah. MCDP-1 acknowledges that not all decisions have to be made, in the blink of an eye. Sometimes you have the luxury of time.
Like in the in the strategic planning phases, where you have more time to gather intel and develop a comprehensive plan.
Exactly. So it's about recognizing those different time frames and adjusting your decision making process accordingly, knowing when to strike quickly and when to take a more deliberate approach.
So being adaptable, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But MCDP-1 also highlights the importance of awareness and intuition in decision making.
It's not just about following a set of rules, right? It's about developing that gut feeling, that intuitive sense of what the right course of action is.
Exactly. And MCDP-1 emphasizes that experience, education, intelligence, all of that contributes to developing that intuitive decision-making ability.
So it's about, cultivating good judgment, trusting your instincts, being willing to act even when you don't have all the answers, which I imagine is most of the time in war.
Exactly. And MCDP-1 is very clear. There's no such thing as a perfect decision in war. I mean, you're always working with incomplete information. You're under pressure, and you know that there could be unexpected consequences to any decision that you make. So it's really about mitigating risk, making the best decision you can with the information you have, acting decisively, and being ready to adapt as the situation changes.
Yeah, so we've covered quite a bit of ground here. We've talked about MCDP-1's view of war as an act of policy, the different levels of warfare, that interplay between initiative and response, the importance of speed and focus and surprise and boldness. We even touched on those fascinating concepts of centers of gravity and critical vulnerabilities.
And we talked about how important decision making is, and that no plan survives contact with the enemy. You always got to be ready to adapt.
So how does ACDP-1 take all this theory and turn it into practical advice on actually fighting a war? Like, how do they bridge that gap between the ideas and the actual boots on the ground reality?
That's where we get into the core of maneuver warfare.
And that's exactly what we'll be exploring in part 3 of our deep dive into MCDP-1. Okay, so let's get into like the nitty-gritty of maneuver warfare. How does MCDP-1 actually put this philosophy into practice? What does it look like in the real world?
Well, it starts by emphasizing something they call orienting on the enemy.
Orienting on the enemy. So that's basically understanding their, strengths and weaknesses, their tactics, their goals, right? But isn't that just like basic intelligence gathering? I mean, every military does that.
It's more than just, gathering intel. MCDP-1, it stresses understanding the enemy as a system, not just, a collection of individual parts.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that mean? Understanding the enemy as a system.
Think of it this way. You're not just looking at like a bunch of individual units or weapons.
Yeah.
You're looking at a complex, interconnected network with physical, moral, even mental components. It's a whole organism, basically.
So their command structure, their logistics, their morale, even their cultural values and psychological vulnerabilities, all that factors into this system.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about identifying those elements that make their system tick. Those centers of gravity that we talked about before.
Right, and then figuring out how to disrupt those elements to break down their ability to fight effectively.
Right, and that's where those critical vulnerabilities come in. You're looking for those weak points in their system, gaps in their defenses, anything that you can exploit to get at those centers of gravity. You got to find a way to crack that nut, basically.
Yeah. It's a much more, nuanced approach than just, trying to overpower them with brute force, right?
Yeah.
It's about finesse, it's about strategy.
Exactly. MCDP-1, it emphasizes that maneuver warfare, it's about fighting smarter, not necessarily harder.
So how do you actually do that? How do you orient on the enemy in a practical sense? What does that look like on the ground?
Well, it involves a lot of reconnaissance, for one thing, gathering intelligence about, their positions, their movements, their capabilities, but it's also about, analyzing that intel, trying to figure out their intentions and predict their reactions. You gotta stay one step ahead.
It's like trying to, get inside their heads, see the battlefield from their perspective, understand how they think.
Exactly, yeah. And MCDP-1, it stresses that this requires, a deep understanding of their culture, their values, their motivations. You can't just look at, the tanks and the guns. You got to understand the people behind them.
You got to know what makes them tick.
Right.
What their goals are, how they think, how they react.
Right. Only then can you truly anticipate their moves and exploit their weaknesses.
Okay, so once you have a good understanding of the enemy, how do you actually, put that knowledge into action? How does that translate into winning battles?
Well, MCDP-1, it talks about a very specific command philosophy that needs to be in place to support maneuver warfare. It's not just about, having good intel. You got to have the right structure in place.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the key parts of that philosophy? What are they advocating for?
Decentralization, for one thing, trust, and a real focus on human initiative. It's about empowering the people on the ground to make decisions.
So it's not about micromanaging everything from the top down, right?
Yeah,
you got to give people the freedom to act.
Exactly. MCDP-1 argues that in a fluid, chaotic environment like war, commanders, they have to empower their subordinates to make decisions on the fly.
Yeah.
Based on what they're seeing on the ground. That's the only way to be truly adaptable.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you're always waiting for orders from headquarters every time something unexpected happens, I mean, you're gonna miss opportunities, right? You're gonna be too slow.
Precisely. And MCDP-1, it emphasizes that initiative is it's crucial to success in maneuver warfare. You got to be able to act. You got to be able to think for yourself.
So commanders need to trust their subordinates, right? To make those good judgment calls and act decisively when the situation demands it.
Right. And that trust, it goes both ways. Subordinates need to trust that their commanders have given them clear objectives and the support that they need to actually accomplish those objectives.
So it's creating a culture of mutual trust and respect.
Right.
Commanders empower their subordinates, and subordinates, they take initiative, they act responsibly.
Exactly. And MCDP-1 also emphasizes the importance of, clear, concise communication within this decentralized structure.
So you're not bogging people down with, a ton of detailed orders and procedures and all that. You got to keep it simple. Right.
Right. They advocate for using what they call mission tactics, giving subordinate, clear objectives and the freedom to figure out how best to achieve them. So you're telling them, what you want them to accomplish, but you're not dictating exactly how they have to do it.
Right. You're giving them the flexibility to adapt to the situation on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
To use their own initiative, their own judgment.
Exactly. And that's where commander's intent comes in.
Ah, yes, commander's intent. So important.
Hugely important. MCDP-1, it emphasizes that commanders, they need to clearly communicate their intent to their subordinates.
So it's not just, giving orders, it's explaining the why behind those orders. Why are we doing this?
Exactly. Why are we attacking this objective? What's the larger goal here? What are we trying to achieve?
So they can make better decisions on the fly, right?
Yeah.
Even when things don't go according to plan, which let's be honest is probably most of the time in war, right?
Absolutely. And MCDP-1 also talks about, designating a main effort.
Right. Right. So you're picking which unit or task force is going to be the tip of the spear, so to speak, the focal point of the attack, the one that gets priority for support and resources.
That's it. The main effort is your primary strike force, the one that's going to deliver that decisive blow.
And everyone else is supporting that main effort, right?
Yeah.
Their actions are all geared towards helping that main effort succeed.
Right. And MCDP-1 stresses that choosing the right main effort, I mean, that's crucial.
It's not just, picking the biggest or the strongest unit. You got to consider, the enemy's vulnerabilities, the terrain, the overall goals. There's a lot of factors that go into that decision.
Exactly. You want to point that main effort towards a critical vulnerability, a weak point that, if exploited, can lead to the collapse of their whole system.
And this is where MCDP-1 talks about, surfaces and gaps.
Yeah, they do. Yeah. Think of surfaces as enemy strong points, areas where they're well defended, prepared to fight. Those are the areas you generally want to avoid.
Right.
Yeah.
You're looking for the gaps, those weak points, those areas where they're vulnerable.
Right, and those gaps can be, they can be literal, like a break in their lines, or they can be more abstract, like a gap in their communications, or a lapse in their their morale.
And those gaps are often fleeting, right? You got to exploit them. You got to exploit them quickly, decisively before they disappear.
Exactly. So you're constantly probing, looking for those openings, and then pushing your forces through aggressively when you find them.
So it's a dynamic approach, constantly adapting, exploiting opportunities as they come up. There's no set playbook.
Right.
Okay, so we've got orienting on the enemy, decentralized command, mission tactics, commander's intent, main effort, surfaces and gaps. What else does MCDP-1 say about how to fight? What other nuggets of wisdom do they have for us?
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it's fascinating.
Well, one thing they really emphasize is the importance of combined arms. Using all your resources together in a coordinated way. Right.
So using everything you've got, right? Infantry, artillery, air power, logistics, all working together, in a synchronized way,
right.
not just operating in isolation.
Exactly. MCDP-1 argues that combining those different elements, it creates dilemmas for the enemy.
Yeah.
Right. It forces them to choose between bad options. They can't focus on everything at once.
So if they focus on defending against your ground attack, they're vulnerable to airstrikes. And if they shift to counter those airstrikes, then they open themselves up to another ground assault. It's about keeping them off balance, right?
Exactly. The key to combined arms is using those different branches, in a way that maximizes their strengths and creates those dilemmas for the enemy. You got to make them react to you, not the other way around.
Each element kind of supporting the others, right? Creating a force that's greater than the sum of its parts.
That's the idea. But MCDP-1 also, it makes it clear that maneuver warfare, it's not just about, specific tactics. It's bigger than that.
Right. It's a mindset, right? It's a way of thinking about war that influences every decision, every action. It's a philosophy.
MCDP-1 actually describes it as, quote, a state of mind born of a bold will, intellect, initiative, and ruthless opportunism, end quote.
So being aggressive, adaptable, always looking for ways to outmaneuver the enemy and achieve a decisive victory.
Precisely.
Wow, what a deep dive this has been. We've gone from the very nature of war to the theory behind maneuver warfare, and now to how that philosophy is actually put into practice. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. It's been a fascinating exploration of MCDP-1. And honestly, I mean, there's so much more we could unpack here. This is just, scratching the surface.
There is, yeah. But I think we've hit on those key takeaways, right?
Yeah.
MCDP-1, it argues that war is this complex human struggle driven by a clash of wills and shaped by all those factors we talked about.
Yeah.
Friction, uncertainty, fluidity, all that good stuff.
And it advocates for a maneuver-based approach, one that values speed, focus, surprise, and boldness. It's about being proactive. It's about taking the initiative.
And it also stresses decentralized command, clear communication, and really empowering those on the ground to take initiative and exploit opportunities as they arise. It's a very fluid and adaptable approach.
And as we've seen, it requires not just physical strength and courage, but also mental agility, adaptability, and a real understanding of the enemy, the human beings on the other side.
What I find so interesting is the MCDP-1. It's so much more than just a military manual, right? It's really a guide to strategic thinking, to decision making, to leadership. I mean, there are lessons here that apply to all kinds of challenges in life, not just war.
Well said, yeah, and that's what MCDP-1 itself says. Quote, maneuver warfare is a way of thinking in and about war that should shape our every action.
That's a powerful statement. So how might this idea of maneuver, apply to other conflicts or challenges we face in our own lives? What are your centers of gravity? How do they influence your decisions and actions? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into MCDP-1. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration. Until then, keep learning, keep exploring,